Okay, we're off. First of all, I'm very flattered to be asked to come and talk to SNH. I finished working with SNH 27 years ago, and I thought I was the last one standing. But I'm glad to see there are some familiar faces and people I worked with all that time ago. So I was given this title. This isn't my title, it's your title. And I gave it a lot of thought, and I really just decided that I would concentrate on two things. One is restoration ecology, and the other is what I call the living forest and the market advantage. So let's whack on into it, and I'll just whiz through it. I'm very conscious that a lot of this is what you already know, but for fun, I thought that we would go through a little bit of background. So if you put the global biomass into one ball, it moves about entirely naturally on the Milankovitch cycle. And I'm sure many of you will know what the Milankovitch cycle is. It's our elliptical journey around the sun, which causes our ice ages and moves things forwards. Until the impact of man. And man comes along 15,000 years ago and starts making serious impacts. And as a consequence, biodiversity has diminished hugely right across the globe. And really the problem, and that's why I want to focus on restoration ecology, because in theory anyway, if we have the use of science and technology, if we use our imagination, our intelligence, if we use people power, and we have political will, it should, in theory, be possible in the 21st and 22nd centuries to rebuild natural capital for the benefit of future generations of people and wildlife. So, for me, restoration ecology is the challenge we all face, rebuilding natural capital for future generations. Now, this is a Living Planet report graph, pie chart, demonstrating how we've arrived at the mess that we're in. Direct hunting, of course, goes right back to the Stone Age. Agriculture, you all know, has removed enormous areas of habitat. Industrial and urban development has both polluted and removed habitat. Translocation is a much, much bigger problem than has been recognized by biologists for many years, whether it's tomatoes or potatoes or rats or goats or donkeys or anything else, moving stuff around the globe has caused huge losses in biodiversity and species. Climate change is, of course, the very big current one. Genetic isolation is a problem I'm going to talk about a little bit later on. And then in green, intentionally, for the future, we hope that the next wave of human impact could restoration ecology. Now, Stone Age man was very remarkable. He did in the woolly mammoth, the woolly rhinoceros, the cave bear, the dire wolf, all sorts of species we know from fossil and ice records. But incidentally, they also produced some of the greatest works of art known to man. I don't know whether any of you have been to Altamira or Lascaux, but if you haven't, try and go. It is a phenomenal experience. Bronze Age man came in with agriculture and grazing livestock, 6,000 to 2,000 years before present, and Iron Age man grew crops, grazed livestock, and had metal tools. He felled forests and created villages and towns. And that's when really things begin to up. And the best example of that here in Scotland is, of course, the loss of the Caledonian pine forest. And if you look at the original range of Cali pine, it's in pale green, and it comes to 6.1 million acres. And if you look at what's left, it is the dots. And the big ones are national nature reserves, and the smaller ones are just a few trees here and there. So we are in no position to dictate to the third world about deforestation. We did it a long, long time ago, and we've suffered the consequences of that ever since. But we are in a position to be able to say to other countries, do what we did. It's very beautiful. I'm very lucky. I live beside Glen Affric NNR and what used to be the Glenstrath NNR, no longer sadly. And by the middle of the 18th century, we had exterminated wolf, we'd exterminated brown bear, the beaver for its wool and its castoreum. We had killed out the great because it had the temerity to eat salmon. We had killed out the rates. We had reduced the ospreys down to the very last pair on the in the 1950s. We had, despite several reintroductions, we had removed the habitat of the greatest forest grouse in the world. And it's still very dodgy. We have now, on our watch, pushed the Scottish wildcat to the very brink of extinction. The pine marten was in a similarly parlous state right through into the 1960s, and then it was the advent of commercial forestry that rescued. And even the late, great Jeff Watson would tell me and insist that golden eagles are only hanging on in Scotland because of the carrion available from red deer dying off in the winter months. And they still are not capable of producing the right ratio of chicks to adult birds to produce a sustainable population. So we're in a mess, and we have not done it well at all. By 1913, we were shipping out 250,000 tonnes of herring every year. Such a massive impact on herring stocks that the herring actually was forced to change its biological reproductive cycle. Instead of being reproducing at 3 years old, it had to drop to 2 years old to survive at all. Not a good record. And if you look at recent losses, we've got the corncrake pushed to the far-flung corners of the islands. We've got corn buntings in free fall. We seem to be persecuting hen harriers out of sight, and it looks as though the poor old curlew and the lapwing are also in pretty serious trouble. So we cannot take any pleasure at all in what nature conservation has achieved. It's been a signal failure. And here am I, a dedicated nature conservationist with a 50-year career behind me, and I am not proud of where we are today at all. I think it's a bit of a disaster. And so we need to explore some of the reasons. This was once Climax Pine Forest. This is a place only a few miles north of where I live, and it's an area of ground I know well, and I've poked about in the peat, and I've seen the roots of the pine trees. It was once Climax Pine Forest. Now, man didn't fell it all. The climate certainly brought it down the hill, but the result is a serious degradation. It's acidification of what little soils were left and creation of blanket peat, but it is also totally misunderstood and still not accepted as being a degraded landscape by many landowners and many land users and other stakeholders. The Highlands is exquisitely beautiful, but it is also significantly empty. The biological term for this latitude, Highland latitude, is species poor. I think you could actually argument that it's almost species absent. If you take a look at the islands in Lochmaree, here is Climax Cali Pine Forest, and it's very beautiful. And there are all sorts of options for human beings and for wildlife on those islands. But the truth is that they were too small for people to bother with. And so they weren't clear-felled, and they weren't burnt, and they weren't grazed, and as a consequence, those options remain. So there is shelter, there is firewood, there's structural timber, there's fruit and game, there is a scientific resource, there's a recreational resource, there is an ecotourism resource in those habitats. And many people enjoy them to this day. But this is not where people have lived historically. That is where people have lived historically. And here on the other side. Not a single stem, no native wood, no soils, a totally degraded landscape. These are the Victorians who built my house at Agus. Ignore the fancy dress of their picnic and just look at the hill behind them. This photograph taken in 1890. That hill is as bald as a plate. It is burned and grazed and burned and grazed and burned and grazed, forgive me, to buggery. It is mamba. It's miles and miles of bugger all. And yet, with just a 35-year restoration ecology project, we now have an all-singing, all-dancing native wood. We do a spring bird count every spring. We have 16 species of birds breeding in our native woodland. We do a bug survey every year. We have rapidly increasing invertebrate populations. We have foxes, badgers, pine martens, you name it, all using that, and 7,000 school children a year. So I think the proof is in the pudding. If you start to put things back and you really work at it and you're committed to it, it delivers. We have introduced beavers, first in 2006. We ran a beaver demonstration project, and we've had over 100,000 interested people, including school kids, through our beaver demonstration project at Aegis. We've wound it down now. We still have one beaver, but it's struggling to breed. That was meant to be a joke, but clearly you're asleep. So let's look at some successful restoration ecology projects. Sea eagles were reduced to rum in 1975. There are now over 130 pairs around Scotland. This is my colleague Roy Dennis reintroducing red kites from Sweden with the help of the IF. We hacked them out on our own land. We now have buoyant red kite populations around Scotland. And we're doing the same with the Aegis wildcat captive breeding project, and I'm going to show you a video a bit later on of our latest kittens which are just born. These are some kittens that were born in our project in 2012. They are very, very beautiful, but you really don't want to put your finger here. We keep them very wild and they are pretty savage. So this was to have been the video. It won't run, I don't think. No, it won't. So we're going to play it for you at the end. But the object is, of course, to reintroduce wildcats to carefully chosen habitat so that they can thrive wild and free. Yet, while these species restoration projects have been successful, the world has continued to inflict terrible damage. And most interestingly, in our time, right now, amongst us, something else very, very interesting is happening. The world is changing. And I think that most people in this room would say about time too. The reality is that our politicians and our leaders of captains of industry and others in society have not paid adequate attention to what is happening around us. And it has taken one little Swedish girl with Asperger's syndrome and these other movements like Extinction Rebellion and Rebel for Life and so on to actually make the politics wake up a bit. People power has begun to demand an end to fossil fuel consumption and is creating a market advantage for going green. Now, do I have to explain a market advantage, or do you all understand it? You do, okay. Fine. I'll come back to it again later on. Governments must now listen, provide incentives, and respond quickly, really quickly. Young people no longer accept the status quo and are demanding change. Carbon emissions must be contained, and agriculture must become sustainable and protect hills. So, what's it all about? And what is it to do with nature on our doorstep? And do we need free? Well, when the Paris Accord in 2015 was announced, my little heart leapt for joy because I thought that at long last we had got world leaders to sign up to something that was a bit meaningful. And then, of course, you will know that Trump has pulled out. So that's a major setback. What that climate change accord included was a common goal to hold temperatures to well below 2 degrees C and to pursue efforts to limit the increase to 1.5. The collective plan was to cut anthropocentric emissions and to achieve a balance by removals and sinks in the second half of the 21st century. Frankly, that was great, but the second half of the 21st century is going to be too late for a lot of people. We've upset the energy balance of our planet very badly, and we are continuing to do so. As the energy accumulates, the world warms. Ice and snows melt, sea levels rise, ocean and atmosphere circulation patterns change, extreme weather events increase, water cycle accelerates, ecosystems fracture, food and water supplies are affected, people and species are impacted. The horror of migration for wretched people who are really struggling. Now, very clearly, we're not in Scotland, but if you lived in sub-Saharan Africa or in those countries on the Horn of Africa, Somalia, Ethiopia, Eritrea, and further north, you would, and if you knew the facts, you would probably want to get out as quickly as you possibly. Now, I found this on the internet, and most interestingly, it comes from the Department of Defense in the United States. So never mind what Trump is saying, this is what the Department of Defense is saying. Rising global temperatures, changing precipitation patterns, climbing sea levels, and more extreme weather events will intensify the challenges of global instability, hunger, and conflict. They will likely lead to food and water shortages, pandemic disease, disputes over refugees and resources, and destruction by natural disasters in regions across the globe. Well, bully for the Department of Defense. What are the leaders of the American administration doing? It will affect everybody at every level of activity, and it has to become the greatest collective action in human history between governments, business, and citizens. And for the first time, there is a real role for citizens in this argument. If you look at the priorities of Western governments, and again, this comes off the internet and is American, but it applies just as much to us. Just look at the priorities that come above climate change. The economy, federal spending, the availability of healthcare, unemployment, the power of federal government, social security system, hunger and homelessness, crime and violence, the possibility of future terrorism, the availability and affordability of energy, drug use, illegal immigration, and the quality of the environment all come before action on climate change. That is the core of the problem we are facing. Our political leaders have not signed up to this as a major problem. Now, we're all dependent on energy. By being here today, by travelling to this event, by using these lights, the heating, the amplification of my voice, we have contributed to the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. There will be carbon atoms generated by this event that will still be in the air that my great-grandchildren will breathe. That is our legacy. And science can't say what's right and wrong. Science can inform, but it can't arbitrate and decide. Science can say that if we burn another 500 billion tons of carbon, the atmosphere, CO2 will go up by another 100 parts per million, and that will lead to warming of the planet to greater than 2 degrees C, with major disruption of the climate system and huge risks for the natural world and human well-being. But it can't answer the moral questions, the value questions. Do we care about the world's poor? Do we care about future generations, our own children and grandchildren? Do we care about nature? Do we see the environment as part of the economy or the economy as part of the environment? The whole point about climate change is that it's not an issue about science, it's an issue about what sort of world we want to live in, what kind of future do we want for our children, and what can we do about it. Now, interestingly, Aldo Leopold wrote these words of wisdom in the late 1930s. A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise. We can work towards a living forest. And this is a particular passion of mine, and forgive me, I feel passionate and express that passion to you because I think it is, I think at the moment we're missing a trick, and it's a very serious trick. A living forest is a dynamic, biodiverse woodland community with massive benefits for us all. Question: why should we worry about forestry more than any other industry? Answer: because forestry is a vital carbon sink and is so exposed to the changes we are already witnessing. Be in no doubt that climate change will drive huge changes to forestry practice in the decades ahead. Aren't we busy creating carbon sinks already? Fair enough. Driven by planting targets and fast-growing exotic species, intensive tree farms have dominated our landscape for 50 years. We need to apply the principles of restoration ecology and living forests to all our woodland plants. The broadleaf deciduous component in all woods needs to be far larger. Now, I'm the first to congratulate the move from 5% to 20% in the Scottish Forest Strategy, but it's not enough. And I'm sorry to say that there are still cynical foresters out there who will plant broadleaves on ground where they will never grow, or in bogs, or in other places, because they don't recognize the value of broadleaves in commercial conditions. Now, I've recently visited Harvard and I've spoken to the School of Forestry in America, and I'm fascinated to discover that their research has demonstrated really clearly that natural forests accumulate and retain far more carbon than plantations, and it is a powerful argument for creating living forests. If you look at the sequestration graph from 1992 to 2008, you'll see that the older a forest gets and the more stable it is, the more carbon it sequestrates. They've measured old growth forest against second growth forest in New England against new plantations, and they've come up with a very, very clear evidence, scientific evidence, that a mix of species, particularly native species, is where we should be going. So a restoration ecology vision does not call for less forestry, please don't misquote me. It calls for more, much more forestry, but designed by a living forest culture. Many of Scotland's bare hills could be forested with multi-age class, continuous cover, biodiverse woods, conifer and broadleaf for sensitive commercial use. So what do we have to do? We have to employ conventional harvesting techniques to restructure existing crops as sensitively and thoughtfully as we can. Because modern clearfell harvesting can be brutal, really seriously brutal. We've all seen it, and we all know what it does to soils, what it does to biodiversity, what it does to wildlife, and what it does to scenery and tourism. And it's deeply damaging to scenery, public enjoyment, tourism, and most importantly, it releases huge amounts of carbon and other greenhouse gases, such as methane, which, for those of you who don't know, is a very much more serious greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. It is also devastating to soils and mycorrhizal associations. It acidifies and silts freshwater systems, damaging fisheries, other wildlife, and the options for people's use and enjoyment of the countryside. Increased storms and wind speed are a huge threat to conventional plantations. Climate change is one of the main threats to forestry, and a strong argument for working towards a living forest. We're going to get more and more violent storms, guaranteed. The forest industry needs to plan proactively for increased wind throw and to mitigate against it by moving to continuous cover woods with small felling coops within a sustainable living forest culture. In living forests, torn up root plates are not a problem. They create niches for many important creatures and organisms for a healthy biotic. Fungi are essential to every living forest, as are habitats for aquatic species. The importance of dead wood has been neglected in our forest culture forever, just about, and yet it's really important in a living forest. We should be aiming for at least 200 cubic meters of dead wood per hectare in all forest woods and stations. Deadwood is an essential component of a living forest, especially for saprophytic fungi and the vital processes of returning nutrients to the soils. We now know that mycorrhizal fungi enable trees and other plants to talk to each other. We need to begin to think about protecting causal associations. Deadwood provides many unexpected microhabitats. Deadwood provides brilliant nest sites for birds, and for lichens and for mosses and liverworts, valuable species in a healthy community, and food and habitat for many species of bugs, beetles, and other insects, all coming together to complete the food pyramids that define a living forest. Wetland is extremely important for biodiversity. Traditional drainage techniques need to be modified to allow wetland to flourish in woodland, in commercial plantations. Landscaping and felling round water bodies to let in more solar energy, essential for biodiversity. Wildlife will quickly colonize and exploit new wetland. Many bird species will find the wetland and move in, as will invertebrates. It happens extraordinarily quickly. And of course, beavers, a keystone species that belongs to wetland ecosystems and will do a lot of the work for us if we just give them a chance. Water shrews, otters and water voles will motor in, and wetlands also an essential resource for environmental education. A living forest vision seeks to influence forest design away from large-scale clear fell to an altogether more sustainable future, delivering these benefits: more effective carbon capture, better flood retention, protection from wind and storm, much more biodiversity, soils building fertility, not losing it, very appealing scenery, multiple benefits for ecotourism and people's enjoyment, and multiple options for industry. Please be in no doubt that because of climate change, future generations of foresters have a very complex and challenging task ahead of them. Living forests are the future for us all. It will require patience and endless compromise, but with care and time, we can make it work for everyone. Now, I've dedicated my career to environmental education, and I'm very proud of having 7,000 Highland School kids through our hands every year, and a further 750 adults on week-long educational programs. Starting young is vital. We need to raise consecutive generations of young people who understand nature, who understand the core values of a natural environment, who are not afraid of it, who find it fun, whose interest is stimulated. Children must be taught to understand and value wildlife and natural processes. And it needs to be fun. That's really important, because one day they're going to be adults and they're going to be voting and they're going to be taking serious decisions, going to need to take serious decisions. And of course, not just for children. Nature is a brilliant way to win hearts and minds. I'm thinking of inviting Fergus Ewing for a day out at Agus. Agus Field Centre works with 160 Highland schools, delivering fieldwork to up to 7,000 school pupils every year. Our adult programmes handle 750 visitors every year. We're one of the most signed up nature conservation nations in the world. Arguably, there are between 3 and 5 million people signed up to nature conservation organisations in the UK, but we are going nowhere because we're not speaking with one voice, we're not coming together, we're not communicating properly, and every NGO and charity and organisation is following its own separate agenda. Again, dear old Leopold said, conservation is a state of harmony between mankind and the land. I wish it was. Now, I've been quoted as saying that I don't like nature reserves. It isn't that I don't like nature reserves per se. I don't like the way that we have used nature reserves during my career. We have herded wildlife into them by removing habitat all around them right across the countryside. We've limited gene pools. We've fragmented habitats. We've taught people to believe that in nature reserves is where nature belongs. We've concentrated too much on endangered species, and we've neglected the wider countryside. If we're going to crack but the biodiversity problem, we've got to move nature out of nature reserves right across the landscape in that direction. For us at Aegis, nature conservation is about knowing and understanding what we've got, conserving what we've got, creating, enhancing and connecting habitats, encouraging restoration ecology, and helping others to enjoy and value nature. Hides are an excellent way to see and learn about wildlife. We have 6 on site, all for different experiences. And here are some images of local wildlife, all of which could be thriving right across Scotland in a few years if we work hard to deliver restoration ecology and forests. And so here are just some nice images. I'm very glad to say that we've got a twin flower project running. Diana Gilbert and Sandy Payne together have collected root matter from areas where twin flower is doing okay and have transplanted them out. We've joined in with that as a project, and our twin flower thriving. Because of the overuse of pesticides, we now face an invertebrate crisis. Those of you who haven't read Mike McCarthy's Moth Snowstorm need to go and read it quickly. It is a very, very scary story indeed. I'm not going to bore you today with the figures, but we're talking about 70 to 90% depletion of many, many invertebrate species across the UK. This is a bee beetle on a thistle. You'd be very lucky to see one day. Tiger beetles are in free fall. And many Lepidoptera populations are also in free fall. Some that we have on site at Aegis: green fritillary, green-veined white, poplar hawk moth, emperor moth, magpie. Wood ants are a sign of a healthy native pine wood. We need to free up licenses to start moving wood ant colonies around in a sensible and organised way because they do such a brilliant job in native pine woods. Lots of tiles. And red squirrels belong to living forests. We've got to get rid of the greys. It's no good messing around to please little old ladies in suburban gardens. Grey squirrels have got to go. We need to pull the plug on the grey squirrel. They're a national biodiversity action plan species, and it's up to see that they thrive, and they won't while the threat of grey squirrels is there. Greys dominate the habitat, they introduce squirrel pox, and they outcompete our natives. They've got to go. And the Scottish wildcat is our most endangered mammal. Hares, rabbits, voles and mice are an important part of the wildcat's diet. The reality is that right across most of our farms, those species are now seriously in decline, and so the food supply is not for wildcats and other predators. Wood mice and voles are a vital food for all carnivores and many birds of prey. A quick look at some of the we're lucky enough to have around us at Aegis. Hopefully are doing okay, although I don't trust it. I've become very sceptical about the future of biodiversity. Herons carry fish eggs on their legs and play and giant oak trees. We have a philosophy at Aegis, particularly for our young children, which is called The Bright Mountain Behind the Mountain, which is a quotation from a poem by Kathleen Raine. We know we have a mountain to climb, but by focusing on the bright mountain, it is possible to get there within a couple of generations. And just to end, I want to mention the quite extraordinary Knepp estate experiment in Sussex. Now, this is a 3,000-acre arable and dairy estate. If you haven't read Izzy Tree's book, Wilding, you need to read it. It's only been going for 12 years. They've turned the whole 3,000 acres over to a rewilding project. Incidentally, I don't like that word, and I'll tell you why in a minute. And the results are phenomenal. They now have the greatest concentration of nightingales in the UK. They have the greatest concentration of turtle doves. They have white storks have motored in from the continent and are now breeding there. They have purple emperor butterflies in a greater concentration than we've seen anywhere in the UK before in several lifetimes. I'm not suggesting that Knepp is the answer. Of course, we're not going to get arable farmers to convert to this. in a hurry. We're certainly not. But what it demonstrates is what you can achieve if you just allow space for nature. The challenge is to make it happen. Stay together, know the flowers, and go. And this is a video I can't play to you. So Agers Field Centre is a project for restoration ecology. It's been my career, it's been the focus of our work since 1976. And the new dawn is restoration ecology.